Yes.
Okay, perfect. Very good. So welcome to our salon on co-creation. My name is Miguel Peromingo, and Eamon Davern and myself created this initiative to give a bit of this cozy space to discuss partnerships in employment services, a topic that we think is discussed a lot, but not often with all the actors that should be involved. So that's why we created this space to have a little bit of an alternative discussion, also in complementary to what networks are doing and what institutions are doing. Last time we talked about partnership delivery in general. It's on YouTube, and today within the partnership topic, we would like to focus on co-creation in employment services. To define it a bit and give a couple of examples of what you're doing on the ground, co-creating with users and with other partners. And let me just quickly present you around the virtual table. We have Emma Crichton, who is the Executive Director of Asuria. She's the Executive Director for Growth and Innovation, Asuria People Services, who is a private employment service in Australia. You will tell us a bit more about it later on. Then we have Azza Hayek, who is Customer Success and Reporting responsible at SkillLab. Very interesting company. And we will hear about that later more as well. We have Jenna Gailly, who is the International Relations Specialist at the Public Employment Service of Brussels, Actiris. Brought an interesting initiative of co-creation and a couple of examples. And we have Alexander Nunn, who is Director of Social, Cultural and Legal Research Center at the University of Derby in the UK, and an expert on public employment services, researching about it for a very long time. So we will not have presentations today. We will basically straight away go and ask you questions. Let me just share a couple of thoughts that I had on co-creation. Basically, it's an interesting concept, and I mean, our society is founded on a principle of co-creation, which is democracy. So in a way, participation in democracy is a kind of co-creation, but it's very institutionalized, it's scheduled, and let's say that in the day-to-day consumption of products, services, co-creation is like not mainstreamed yet, but it's a rather new trend for some years now already. But there is this perception that having people co-create and having people more involved in producing products and services is not only good because you know what they want, but it's also adding actual value to the whole process by better identifying the social demands and by maybe tackling challenges in a way that is unconventional and that can help solve things that haven't been solved before, which is in the topic of employment, social affairs, I think, quite important, because there are a lot of issues that we haven't been able to solve for a long time. So large companies are using co-creation for a while already, for years. I came across examples of Unilever, who is involved users in their product packaging. Then there's IKEA, who is collecting ideas for basic furniture functionality. There is BMW, who has done a lot of crowdsourcing for ideas to design their cars. Also, this is, of course, very organized, often in type of award setting and not mainstream. But there is this spirit of tackling challenges commonly, involving people, sharing responsibility in a way, and also a higher tolerance for trial and error and for making mistakes, like creating a little bit more of a mistake or error culture in a learning environment, and also building some community confidence. Employment services, public employment services, private employment services, third sector has been starting to use that too. I can see a lot of initiatives on human-centric approaches, which involves co-creation. There is a lot more use of behavioral psychology in designing products and services for job seekers. We will hear about that a bit later in addressing barriers to employment or also entrepreneurship. And there is more involvement of individuals. There are a couple of public employment services that have innovation labs that have, kind of factories, virtual factories where users, job seekers are invited to help programming, help designing UX experiences. And there is also some hesitation in the use of co-creation, because it's honestly also not always easy to involve people from outside the own institution because of legal barriers, because also of cultural barriers. So it's good to see initiatives that try to break those traditions and open a little bit more the field for co-creation. And for that, we would like to discuss with you what are your views on that, what are your ideas, and also mainly what are your experiences also in doing it, basically, because you're doing it. And for that, I would like to pass the word to Eamon for a couple of questions, and then to you to discuss about this. Thanks.
Okay, thanks very much, Miguel, for setting the scene very nicely. I think in the world of social policy, certain phrases suddenly emerge, and from the first time that you've heard them, it sometimes only seems a matter of days before they seem to be part of the narrative and the discourse, and everybody is mentioning them, particularly in relation to co-creation. I think it's a phrase that's being used increasingly frequently in the world of public employment services. And I think probably the first important task for our discussions this morning is to try and put a bit more clarity and substance about what perhaps co-creation means. So I'd like to start by perhaps asking a question of Alex, if I may. I mean, Alex, in terms of co-creation, I mean, do you think potentially at the moment it's a kind of a buzzword, an idea that's looking for some kind of specific definition to sort of support it and clarify it? Or do you think there is now real substance behind the concept of co-creation in the delivery of employment services? Have you got any kind of particular observations about that aspect?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it is obviously a very trendy term, and I kind of smiled, a wry smile when you said about, you know, concepts coming up and then they seem to be everywhere. And I must admit, you know, it has been around for a few years now in relation to public services generally. And I must admit, I kind of ignored it for a while, thinking it was just one of those buzz phrases. And does this make any sense? And actually, I came at the idea from a different set of research. So it wasn't around public employment services, it wasn't around really public services, or at least on the margins. So I've been doing a lot of research with artists and participatory artists. And they use the terms co-creation, co-curation, co-production very, very frequently. And what became very clear was that there's a lot of struggle over what precisely that means. So there's some controversy about, you know, whether arts practice that is an artist having an idea and then involving other people in the process, whether that is really co-creation because they've already thought up the idea. And yes, it might be nice that people are involved and they choose to be involved, but they're not really co-creating the artistic output because that's already preconceived. And then there's some questions about ethics in relation to all that. So that got me thinking about co-creation and listening to people like Francoise Matarasso, who's really interested on this kind of concept. And then obviously reading the literature, I think the idea is more kind of embedded in the kind of business and management literature. And I kind of smiled when Miguel said about IKEA, because obviously they engage you in creating the product as well as the, as the idea, right? And I'm sure all of us have felt some of the frustration when you get to the end and you haven't got the little, whatever it is, you know, I don't know what they call those things. We all know what they are anyway. But I'm not sure that is co-creation always, because it might be some form of co-creation, but it's not an equal partnership. partnership, and certainly not in terms of control of the output or who takes value out of the process. People might contribute value, but they don't necessarily take value out. And I think I won't go on too much about public employment services yet, because I'm sure the conversation will come round to that. But I think there is a lesson to be learned, both from the controversy in arts, but also thinking about who really is taking value out when BMW or Facebook involve you in creating value for them. Are you getting an equal control over the process and an equal outcome, equal share of the outcome? And then just one final thing, because I thought Miguel's introduction was really interesting, because as I was thinking about, making my notes on the screen here to think about talking today, I did come back to the idea that democracy is co-creation. If you go all the way back to Kant and communicative inclusion, and Habermas, thinking about, being involved in citizen discussions to control our shared public realm, that takes us to some really quite interesting places about what public employment services might do with the idea of co-creation. But I'll stop there, because I've talked for long enough, and I'm sure other people want to come in on some of these points.
Yeah. I mean, thank you. That's really fascinating. I actually conjured up an image of a flat-packed delivery of a public employment service, as you mentioned, IKEA, which I don't know whether that's something we should be kind of welcoming or slightly kind of concerned by, but fascinating. And I think the point you made as well about where does actually creation start in delivery or production of some kind of entity or product, or where are you picking up from something that's already there, is very, very important as well. That's certainly got, as you said, as well as being a philosophical question, they're ethical ones. And I think the whole point about the value added from this co-creation process and what it means in welfare terms for the distribution of that is actually a very interesting and politically sensitive subject as well, actually. So thank you. That's raised some very, very interesting thoughts to start to frame our discussion.
Maybe Eamon, Eamon, instead of Pez is saying you've got a black box, maybe they say you've got a flat pack.
Well, actually, these metaphors do come into play quite quickly. And actually, the point you made there, Emma, about the black box, I think is very, very appropriate, because, as I'm sure all colleagues are aware, there was much debate when I think the UK first developed the work programme about a decade ago about the black box. And the black box was seen as perhaps at that time, I think, the kind of largest degree of letting a provider get on with production, really, essentially. And then I think in Ireland, they decided they needed a grey box, because there were concerns about some of the points that Alex very nicely made there. And there was certainly the view that we had to have something that being very opaque. There were issues there as well, which is quite interesting. So thank you. An interesting point there. If I could ask, as there actually a question sort of leading on from this, Azza, you were, I think, very involved absolutely at the start of the skills matching application that's now the main product of the SkillLab. I mean, perhaps taking on board some of the points that we've heard already about where a co-production process starts and how much genuine input there is for the end user or the citizen. Perhaps, Azza, could you give us a bit of background as to how you developed your product from first principles, perhaps?
Yeah, thank you, Ayman, for this question, but maybe it would be useful to give you at least a little bit of background about the SkillLab, what exactly we are doing.
Yes, thank you. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So SkillLab, we are an impact business. We work in partnership model with employment services. And we are not talking about only public employment service, but all organizations that are working with people to help them to find employment and pathways to long-term careers. So together with our partners, we empower people to turn their skills into careers. About our tool, we developed a solution that uses artificial intelligence system to help people explore, capture, and express their skills to enable our partners to better understand their clients and connect them to relevant careers and education. Now we have partnership in 24 countries in Europe, in Latin America, Africa, and in MENA region. So if you want to talk about co-creation in this context, co-creation is so important, and I just want to tell you that this is one of the most challenging things that we faced when we started to develop this tool, because we are talking about a wide range of users. When we are talking about job seekers, every one of those job seekers, they have their challenges, their way to be motivated to find or to use this tool to help to make this tool helpful for them to find a job and to overcome those challenges. So the first thing that we started in our company, that we started to make this or the human-centric approach to be a mindset and a culture in our country. So to make sure that everyone in SkillLab believes that people who face the problem that we aim to solve for them are the ones who hold the key to their answers. How we are doing this? We started with the empathy workshops in the team. So all of us are aligned to create innovative solution rooted in people's actual need. And in those empathy sessions, we were involving all the team, not only the product development team, also the designers, the developers, the sales and business development team, to know more about the people that we are designing for, their needs, their motivation, and understand the context in which problem exists. Usually in our, as I just said, finally, we reach to the point that we really consider that our end users are the experts in this field. We don't know as much as they know about the problems and how this problem should be solved. So talking about the design process of our tool, as I just said, we make sure that we use the human-centered design approach. So we focus on the users, their needs in each phase of the design process. I won't just go in details in technical things to tell you what design process and how we do that, but in general, we involve users throughout the design process via a variety of research and design techniques to create or to make sure that we are creating for them a highly usable and accessible product. So as tools, we are using mixture of investigative methods and tools like surveys, interviews, usability tests, and user experiences research for our users. We have them the same room also for, let's say, using generative methods like brainstorming sessions. We have them in the same room with the product development team, with the designers and all the stakeholders. So we have this conversation and we know exactly what is the frustration, where exactly they need to be motivated, how to make sure that they will get the best out from this tool. We usually also, this is like a continuous process, not only when we start to design the tool, it's along all the journey with our users. So to do that, we make sure that we have open communication channels between us and the users. And this is through our in-app chat. So we have in our application chat functions where our users can reach out anytime for us. We answer their questions, we receive feedback, we also develop our tool or improve our tool based on those questions and feedback. We have also other channels like email. We have users community as well. So we make sure that we are in the ground, in the field with the users all the time. So know exactly how we can just make this tool tailored for them. In addition to that, also we keep tracking the user's satisfaction by using different KPIs like Net Promoter Scores, user satisfaction. We keep tracking when we develop every new feature. We just make sure that, okay, till now we have our users satisfied about this futures. And for sure, we keep doing a lot of evaluation and feedback sessions that we, the people who are in the field, interpret the insights from these feedback sessions and evaluation sessions to interpret them to the product development team and the designer of our tool.
Thank you very much. That's all extremely interesting. I think the point you made towards the end actually about KPIs is particularly relevant because, of course, KPIs based on what the customer, the user themselves perceives to be the success of the system. On one hand, of course, that is probably the ultimate test of something's working, because if somebody doesn't perceive it to be useful, they will opt out. But perhaps as we move on briefly in a moment to have a input from Jenna, from a public sector perspective, there are always some kind of political tensions in the amount of influence you place on customer service key performance indicators as part of the overall basket of measures. They're seen as very important, but there are other issues as well. And I think also, as you very nicely explained, how I think your intention is very much to promote autonomy amongst the users of your product. And the idea is that they should be much more in control of actually what happens in terms of their agenda for building up their skills to help them reintegrate into the labour market. Jenna, perhaps a very nice to be able to bring you in now. I think from a personal perspective, your organisation has been really there with the zeitgeist in terms of thinking about what co-creation means. I think you've also been thinking very innovatively about how the public sector will have their kind of continuing role in the future in an extremely changing world, particularly in the last year, not least with COVID. But I'd like to start by perhaps asking you a question. When we were looking at this, doing some work for the European Union, it wasn't easy to find examples of PES who have been very involved in co-creation, but it was a real breath of fresh air to come across Actiris, because you've been involved in this game for quite some time, actually. So perhaps could I ask you maybe two things? How did you get into the co-creation kind of space quite early, really? And why do you think co-creation is important for a public employment service?
Yes. My cat is in a co-creative mood as well. So you might pop by again. Yeah. Indeed, Actiris, I think the co-creation comes from our long history in partnerships, working in general. There's, of course, many different ways of working in partnership, and co-creative partnerships are, let's say, a niche, even for us. So even when we do quite some of them, it's still at this point a minority. But they stem from the wish, the desire, and the need to respond to local needs. So we, Actiris, we work on the level of the Brussels capital region, and of course, in the different neighborhoods in Brussels, there are different challenges related to unemployment. And we have in Brussels as well a very rich ecosystem of very different local organizations that some of them exist longer than us. So they have an expertise that they want to share with us. And so it was quite natural that when about 10 years ago, we really got the go from the regional government to invest in local partnerships, it was natural to do that in a co-creative way. We cannot, as a regional service, know what is going on locally. So we put together the local partners and have them decide what the needs are. Every year they create together different projects that can be smaller or bigger. And that was really the main center nucleus of co-creation within Actiris. And I think the people involved in these local projects, so we have about 15, something like that, maybe a bit more local coordinators. The people involved, they are enthusiasming, and other people within the PES saw what they are doing, and I think said, oh, I want to be part of that process. Or they heard from the partners involved that they were happy about this kind of contact with the PES, which isn't usually the case. You know, the PES we subsidize, we are big, we have power, so we create conflict. And it's just nicer to be in this human way, equal way, together. And so I think that is one of the reasons why this co-creative idea is, we see it now in more, maybe bigger projects, more classical PES services like job placement, counseling, as well, because we have realized that not only you create better services by involving everybody, you understand the complex problem better and the solution is better, but you create buy-in for the final decision. Because everybody has heard the different points of view, has gained understanding of what is important for each different actor, and you can overcome initial resistances, and as well, no decision will be perfect. We have so many limitations, budget, resources, etc. So to create buy-in for the unperfect but best decision possible, that is something we're trying to aim at now. But I agree that with your initial comments that, you know, co-creation is a buzzword, we, I think, need to be careful that when we start using co-creative mechanisms in these more traditional PES design of PES services, that they are proper co-creation indeed, and that we pay attention to indeed the equal share of everybody in the process and in the outcome of it. Those are attention points. Yeah.
No, that was, thank you. No, please, that's excellent. No, please carry on. I didn't wish to kind of stop your flow if you wanted to add to that, because
yeah, I just stopped.
Yeah, no, thank you. No, that was thank you. That was a really, again, an excellent contribution there. You mentioned, Jenna, really the kind of perhaps not so much the risks, but things we need to consider about developing co-creation in a traditional kind of public sector context, because obviously intrinsically public sectors in most cases perhaps have more traditionally been administrative top-down organisations with the power really vested in the centre of the organisations on behalf of the government, and co-creation in a sense is kind of releasing some of that power and giving more of that to the citizen in a way that I think we probably all agree will be positive and the way to go, but there are obviously some quite sensitive challenges there. I think you really helpfully mentioned how co-creation and the ecosystem are in a sense intrinsic to each other, because co-creation is a way of enabling this ecosystem to develop and hopefully flourish. And I think also you made some very other interesting points that perhaps we had not considered earlier when we were thinking of designing this event. Actually, I think, as you mentioned, of all European countries, Belgium has perhaps got one of the longest traditions of partnership working, going back a long way, perhaps over 100 years, in terms of the influence of non-governmental and partnership organisations, which is very interesting. And I think you made the point as well about the need to actually not only operate at the regional level, which of course you do, but also the local neighbourhood level, to really ensure you can be in a true partnership with your most priority kind of service users and citizens. So there is clearly something about the spatial dimension to co-creation as well, and the kind of area within which you are co-creating rather. And I think, as you said as well, more and more policy thinking is now about the need to be engaging at the regional level, the city level, and even the neighbourhood level as well, which big organisations often find more difficult because of the structural implications of being that involved in some fairly specific local geography. So thank you very much. That was really fascinating, and we'll get back to some more points on the issues you've raised perhaps a bit later. if I could hand over to Emma now. Of course, in an Australian context, some of the earliest kind of real co-creation between the public and private sectors was in delivery of employment services in Australia now, going back perhaps almost a quarter of a century. So it's remarkable how quickly time flies. But Emma, in your organisation, you are involved in supporting perhaps some of the most vulnerable groups with the services that you provide. Have you got any observations or thoughts on why co-creation is particularly important in terms of engaging with those who are the most vulnerable, inactive people, those farthest from the labour market?
I hope I do, but and I should have in my role. And as I'm listening to the conversation, I can't help. I also lead our business development, so I lead procurement. And I've been in a co-creation session today with a group of frontline work coaches and a behavioural scientist, Darren Coppin, and myself. But we're waiting on an RFP, which will be very specific. And to win that, we've got to score points. And do we chuck out everything we did today when we see what we have to bid against? And lose some of that, or do we talk about this approach that we'll take in and gamble that will be attractive in the evaluation room? We've been doing a lot more like SkillLab, where you say your end users are the experts in your product. I mean, that's the same with us. We're so far removed from unemployment by the time you get to the point of writing these bids that you need to go back and put yourself in the shoes of the customer. The other complex thing in Australia is we have an activation model, which is called mutual obligation, where job seekers really are mandated. They're voluntary, non-voluntary clients of ours, where they have to do a certain amount of things to remain receiving their benefits, that we hope we can work with them in a co-designed manner to make it meaningful, to transition them to work quicker, faster, in a more meaningful way. But it's a pretty complex balance that we strike there with an end user, and the compliance framework in which we operate, and the legislation in which the Australian Public Employment Services operates, not unlike where we also operate in Sweden, which is a user choice model. We often have a term about this: here's your black box, design it, tell us what you'll deliver, how you will fast track the most vulnerable furthest removed from the labour market into employment. But they haven't quite cut the umbilical cord, because they still want to control how we do that and control the market and how much market share we have, and this co-opetition where we compete with other providers, but we have to collaborate in the best interest of labour market needs. So I don't think I've answered anything, Eamon, but we certainly, I suppose one thing we talked about today in this session was that it's often through the data that we learn more about the end user than we do perhaps through the interviews and the appointments, which are mutual obligation in respect. But we learn more about who they are and what their needs are and what their stages of change are through using behavioural economics or behavioural science assessments. Yeah. Where you can categorise at what stage of change a job seeker is in their desire to go back into work. We use a couple of different assessments. One has 5 stages of change. It's a bit of a widget model. It's exactly the same type of behavioural economics that was first pioneered in the quit smoking campaigns in the UK, where they stopped applying the same sort of interventions to the smoker that was pre-contemplative, or the smoker that was at the action stage, I really want to stop tomorrow. And that same concept is used in employment services in many providers now globally. And we're one of the early adopters of that, where we have a different service delivery model approach to job seekers that are in the action stage, ready to be put in front of an employer, to a job seeker that's sort of telling us they want a job, but they're happy with their unemployed lifestyle or their cash lifestyle, or other things are going on in their life, to those that really can't even conceive of the concept of work. but because they have to visit us and because they have to pretend to get a job to maintain their employment, that they say the right things. And behavioural science has assisted us to work with those groups in different ways.
Thank you. I think you were being rather modest there, and I think along with all of your colleagues, you've really answered the question splendidly and opened lots of other food for thought actually there. The point you made about the relationship between the degree of rigour in a kind of a regime for managing benefits and co-creation is interesting, and maybe there are certain tensions in a more rigorous regime, or maybe not, I don't know, but that's an interesting point, and I think very relevant context. And I think Sweden has got a fairly kind of rigorous regime as well, hasn't it, for monitoring the receipt of benefits. I actually scribbled nudge down just before you mentioned the UK smoking campaign, because of course that's absolutely correct, and I think there's more enthusiasm in public employment services for thinking about those approaches now than there was initially, where it was seen as something quite out there and rather kind of risky. But I think the key point you made—
Alex wants to say something, I think. Sorry.
Yeah, please, no, come in. Yeah, do. Yeah.
Just on the nudge thing, I think that kind of, and behavioural economics, I think that raises some of those, and exactly for the reasons that Emma suggests, raises all sorts of problems. I would say anything that starts with nudge or anything like that can't possibly be co-creation, because you've already decided what's good for somebody else, and you're going to secretly nudge them towards that preconceived outcome. And that doesn't mean to say that it might not be effective. It might be really effective, but it can't possibly be co-creation.
Actually, Alex,
it's in debate. I mean, it's in COVID has put nudge into feverish debate against behaviour. And they say that COVID has been the one thing that has taught us that nudge is ineffective. So I know the jury's still out and the data's still inconclusive, but I know even at our NISA conference next week, there's a whole session on the fact that COVID has taught us that some of this CBT approaches through digital nudging, it didn't work. It didn't work in COVID across, not just in our sector. Anywhere.
Mm-hmm.
They're separate. In any case, they're separate questions, aren't they? About what's effective in realising a particular outcome is different to what is a co-created outcome. They're different sets of conversations, I think. And obviously, where you've got a legislative environment where there is a mandated outcome, and actually for all the black boxes there are rather mandated processes too, then that there is a limit to where you can go with co-creation. I think it might be about involving people, making it human-centered to the extent that you can, but I would say that the extent to which you can do co-creation in those environments is fairly limited, and that might be part of I think that kind of activation moment might have been a kind of moment in time which might have been 25 years long at him, but it's something I think we might be moving away from in thinking about complex lives, the complexity of the labour market, portfolio work, all those kinds of things that mean actually that kind of sense of activation and a predetermined outcome might actually be going rather out of fashion quite quickly in the future.
Yeah. Thank you. You actually really nicely kind of telegraphed a question I wanted to bring you on, Alex, actually, because you've done lots of work for the European Union, particularly looking at the whole subject of target regimes and the way targets start to drive performance in employment services. And I know you've made the point many times, I think very appositely, that targets are so intrinsically linked to budgets and resources, and how governments and financial ministries decide it's worth investing or not in employment services. Apologies for rather a kind of, maybe, I don't know, very general question, but how do you see the classic kind of new public management target regime circa 1990 sitting with a co-created model of employment services? And I appreciate that's a really difficult question, but are they compatible at all?
It's a kind of an interesting thing, isn't it? Because on the one hand, involving service users in the governance, setting direction, setting targets, all those kinds of things is on the one hand the most radical thing you can do.
Yeah.
But actually, I think it's probably the thing that most public employment services would be more comfortable with, because there is a kind of a tradition in many places of, you know, corporatism, and also the kind of co-creation that Azza started with, which is a kind of a design, kind of representative co-creation in the design process. I think that actually, even though it's the more radical element, is probably the bit that's easiest to contemplate. I think that the thing that's possibly, and certainly if you're going to talk about co-creation, that is necessary. But I think the thing that's harder, and maybe it's linguistically harder because we just use different phrases like personalization or individualization, those kinds of things. But I think the bit that's harder is surrendering control, or not surrendering, or sharing control at the point of service, individual service creation. So the bit around targets, I think that's important and, you know, necessary to the co-creation journey. But it's perhaps the bit that organizations around the table thinking about PES services are perhaps most familiar with. I don't know if others think that.
Yeah, indeed. Jenna, perhaps if I could bring you in, if I may, perhaps ask you a couple of questions. How has the kind of concept of co-creation and giving more power essentially to end service users, has there been a kind of difficult discussion in your organization about how far you might want to pursue some of this, really? Because you've come in from a classic contracting model. We're now talking a lot more about kind of co-creation and perhaps giving more scope to the service users to devise their own kind of programs and things. Is there openness to that kind of more risky approach? Or I think it's something that people might want to shut down because of the implications of it going wrong, maybe?
First, to be clear, most of the co-creation in Actiris is with our partner organization, so not with the actual end user of the service that we co-create.
Thank you. Yeah.
I really find this debate on the co-creation of the targets fascinating.
Yeah.
I actually feel that very personally that we are going in the opposite direction here, that maybe we are going, you say the 90s, maybe we're going back to the 90s, and maybe we were a bit more progressive a couple of years ago. I feel a tendency to restrict targets really to how many people put into employment, in training, etc. While it was possible before to have targets about the evolution, personal development of the job seeker, etc. And is it related to European financing, who they want these targets to be reached? Is it related to these management and performance indicators? But I was some colleagues working on partnerships with very vulnerable groups came to me with this question: Jenna, what do other PES do? We need to, we need to get them. We need to respect these targets, employment, training, etc. But actually, we feel that more soft indicators could be more valuable for the end user. So I have no answer.
Well, no, but I think you raised some really kind of excellent questions. Perhaps if I could develop some of that with Emma, actually, if I may. I think Jenna was alluding to the kind of,
for just moving to the second point. I just want to
yeah, of course, yeah,
I have a point for Jenna, because I am talking from the other side, from the end users of the public employment services, because the nature of my work just allowed me to talk a lot with people who are really clients for public employment services, and a lot of interviews when we are asking about what the challenges that you are facing in the labor market. And the one that I heard in many countries, not only here in Belgium or in Netherlands, everywhere, everyone just was saying they don't listen to us. they don't ask us about our feedback, if really we are satisfied of the service that we are delivering from those public employment services. It's always coming from the other side, like the public employment services or the users or the clients, that they want to make sure that the people in public employment services, they are satisfied. That's why sometimes they get the attitude that, okay, we want to accept any plan they give to us. We want to accept any job they want to give us because we want them to be satisfied, not and vice versa. So I think this is the most important point when we are talking about co-creation, to listen more to the people in the field and to ask them, okay, what do you think about the service that we are delivering to you now? What your expectations from us?
Thank you. I think you make a very good point there, Azza, because logic suggests that in any area of activity, the more that you engage with your customers in a way that they respond to, the more successful you will be. And the argument in public employment services has often been that if you meet the customer's expectations, you will actually not have them coming back again because you've not delivered what you're required to deliver for them first time. And of course, governments fund employment services to do things once, but don't fund them to do things again because something's been done incorrectly the first time. So as a logical proposition, it's very clear. But I think perhaps as Jenna would, I think probably confirm, proving the link between successful customer service and outcomes in the world of public employment service and target delivery is very, very, very difficult. And Alex, I'm sure will contradict me if I'm wrong, but I'm not sure if anybody's quite kind of cracked that particular holy grail so far. But very interesting. I think the point you make there, that the most common perhaps criticism of users of public services from citizens is they're not actually listening to us, or maybe not delivering what we are expecting. Perhaps if I could bring Emma in now on that point, actually.
Yeah.
A couple of our colleagues, Emma, have kind of hinted at, I suppose, employability measures and what I think we've often called in the UK distance travelled models. One of the concerns of organisations is when you deal with the most vulnerable people, getting them closer to work is a real triumph and an incredible achievement. Financial ministries often don't want to fund until they've got a job outcome tick in the box, essentially. Quite a lot of work's been done on distance travelled models. Governments have not been so keen to kind of necessarily adopt them as key performance metrics. Have you got any views on what we can do to kind of tackle that challenge, particularly when it's linked to contracts and financing and things? Yeah.
Have I got any views? How long do we have?
Yeah, well, please, no, because it's a very interesting subject. So, yeah.
I mean, I think why it's so complex, even those last points that Azza was raising, is when we say customer, when we as a provider have three. So the customer satisfaction survey, which are always, dubious anyway in any market, even for IKEA. We've got the government who are purchasing us. We've got the employer, and we've got job seeker. And in liberal markets, or when you tend to have more right wing governments in control, definitely the employer in the government's view is the customer, and the job seeker is a product that we are paid to produce. If we have more Labor governments, we tend to have the job seekers more of the customer and the employer's the product. So we have to flex regardless of that. And then as far as outcome funding goes, and it doesn't match, it doesn't flex with labour market conditions, and labour markets are moving at a pace that they'll never get those pay mix correct for. They don't. They're too scared to recognise gig economy as outcomes. So of course, as a provider, you're going to look for full-time work. Even offshore employment's not an outcome. And then, in a country like Australia with the oil and gas industries that could be occurring in like Timor, but you're working out of Darwin, what motivates us to get that person a nicely paid job in that industry when we're not going to get an outcome for it? I think it's also in the UK here, and certainly across Europe, one of the problems with the aged care sector, and why we can't, besides the fact employers, the pay is terrible, that gig style of insurance models in those care sectors for people to get, for providers to achieve an outcome on payments that exist in most PESs that I know, is very complex. And then we have this speed to placement. You know, this equals this amount and you'll get paid then. And with COVID, I suppose, you know, that for the new restart providers in the UK, that could be quite attractive, that they could get a pilot, like they could get that first outcome payment quite quickly, as opposed to a long-term unemployed person that's going to go into shelf packing or fruit picking. So there could be swings and roundabouts in the UK market at the moment, but here it's certainly not going to happen, because we're the opposite. We can't get enough staff. We don't have immigration, the 457 visas, who tend to do a lot of the entry-level work, aren't here, and employers we have this booming economy at the moment in Australia, and in domestic tourism's never been better, and there's no staff. We can't get them, and we can't bring them in. So I don't know if PESs will ever be able to keep up with the agility that labour markets throw in our faces, and if we'll ever be able to get payment outcomes that match labour market demand. It doesn't look like it's here for a bit, and I don't think activation's going anywhere, Alex. Definitely not in the world I live in anyway. I think that's way too scary. I can't see it going away. It's too popular. I think the stick style, like if employers say don't make them apply to us 40 times a month, I think they'll listen to that. But I don't think they'll say you can't. You cannot have to do 25 hours of activity. Can't see it moving.
I think there's.
I'd like to.
Sorry, Jenna.
Thank you.
Jenna, then Alex. Thank you. Yeah, thank you.
On the financing thing, I'd like to say, I mean, we set those outcome performance targets, but we don't finance based on them. We finance on service delivered, and we pre-finance the service delivery. And that is, I think, really important in our culture. The service delivered is still more important than getting the outcome and getting the money. So that's an important thing, and I think it makes us strong as well in our partnerships.
Thank you. Alex, you wanted to come in there as well?
Yeah. I mean, I was struck when I was listening to Jenna talk before about working at a regional level and not knowing what's right at a neighbourhood level. That's so radical in a kind of UK context, whereas working at a regional level would be really localized, really flexible, but also the kind of constraints and the kind of sanctions and incentives that you're working with, Emma. And I was going back to that idea you asked about targets and so on, Eamon. I wonder if a really good way of thinking about some of this was about thinking about the co-creation of the type of labour market that we want to see, because certainly in the UK, the kind of institutionalized environment that we've got around labour market services hasn't created this, but it certainly contributed to quite a problematic labour market in many respects. And the kind of cycling in and out of low paid work damages productivity. It's not great for firms really, because they don't have any incentive, they don't have those beneficial constraints to invest in technology and invest in increasing productivity and so on. So I wondered if kind of taking all that together, thinking about co-creation in quite a radical way at a local level about what kind of labour market do we want to see in this place, might be one way of opening up that kind of co-creation and really radically challenging some of those constraints that you're working with, Emma, because they sound dreadful to work with to me, and that point about flexibility is, really well made. If you set a target and a set of performance payments over a 5-year contract, and then a pandemic happens, but it doesn't have to be as radical as that, does it? It just, sector change, or
could be Amazon. An Amazon model comes in and takes over a region, and that it's too easy for me to say to my team, think about your own buying habits when I hear them buying off Amazon. Walk down to your high street. Like, here we are in a company that wants to put these people in front of us into jobs, but everyone in lunchtime's going and buying off Amazon. Think about your own consumer patterns to create the labour markets that we co-design.
Yeah.
But then we don't contribute to them flourishing because we're dealing with monopolies, and we're sucked into that.
So in a sense, we've got. Sorry, Jenna, please come in. Yeah.
It makes me think of the territoire zéro chômeur de longue durée, the territories without any long-term unemployment that France has been implementing, and in Brussels we're looking at how could we do this, adapt this to Brussels, and I mean, this radical co-creative rethinking of the labor market. The idea there is that a long-term unemployed person costs the Belgian state about 40,000 euro, rather than just having this passive cost. We could use that money to employ the person and ask the person, what can I do? What do I want to do? And have this, they call it, I have to translate from French to English, an enterprise with an employment goal. Have them create a job based on the skills and desires of this person that is as well valuable for the local community and for the planet. That would be nice as well. And that is a completely different view on employment. That's really important, right, for everybody.
That's very interesting. If I can come in for a second,
please.
Because that basically challenges this whole idea of what work is, how employment works, and kind of sees it more from the side of purpose. What can people do instead of thinking in what work is out there and how can we fit the people into that work. So that's, I think, very fascinating, and also the sound of future from my point of view as well. And the question I have here is, in order to kind of know more about people like long-term unemployed, that naturally you don't have enough information of what they want to do or what they can do, other than what has been generated maybe in some very formalized interviews. The key to that is data, and I think we have a lot more data, and in that respect it's kind of funny that we're saying we're moving back to the 90s, because in fact we have a lot more data than back in the 90s, so we would be able to do much more with it. Long story short, my question to Azza now is, because you are working in a data generating, data collecting company, the breadth of data you get about the skills of the job seekers, the skills of the people that use your application, would you think that there is potential there to have people work in wider areas than they're usually associated with? Do you get enough information about their skills, their interests, their potential to work with that? And the second question, is anybody working with that?
Yeah. Okay, this is a great question, because I just wanted also to comment about this point about data, because yes, we have a lot of data now, but all the data is about the labor market, the demand in the labor market, what the skills that are needed in the labor market. We have a lot of research, a lot of studies, but the lack of data, or the shortage of data in the supply side. What are the skills that we have now in the labor market, and how we can map those skills with this labor market that we have now, with all the trends that is affecting the labor market, unstable labor market, everything just changing, especially recently with COVID-19. So it's so important for for the clients or the job seekers from their side to know more information about the jobs and the skills that are needed in the labor market, and how exactly they can invest on their skills in this labor market. So one of the challenges also that I was hearing from the user is the lack of information. They don't have enough information about the labor market, where exactly they can work, how they can use the skills that they gained from their past experience with new labor market, the new reality that we need to have. We have a lot of user case, let's say, that they used our tool SkillLab, especially in Latin America, and we have some also here in Europe, that after using a tool like our tool that helps them to explore and express their skills in a granular level, help them to give them more ideas about where exactly they can work. And there would be an opportunity to have something between their desire and their abilities, and also from the other side, the client manager or the public employment services that help them to tell them if this is a reality, a realistic ambition or a realistic option for them to work. So by having all those data points, let's say, the skills that I have, the skills that are needed, what I want to work as a job seeker, and what is my abilities and where can I use them, this would lead for a deliver or more sustained career opportunities for those people.
Thank you.
Interesting.
Yeah. I think you described a really interesting kind of potential performance measure.
Sorry, just
yeah.
I'm not surprised that it worked in Latin America, because there's a very high level of informality there, and certainly not advocating on informality. It's terrible. It needs to be tackled. But what it brings about is alternative ways of managing your skills, because they got to work somewhere. They don't have formal settings. They don't have qualifications that they can prove on a piece of paper, but people work and they get a lot of skills. So I've seen in Latin America, there's a lot of initiatives also from public services to kind of start managing that in a more targeted way to have these people work somewhere in a way that is decent. So, yeah. And I think with applications like yours, that can help a lot.
Yeah.
So, now I shut up.
Actually, in Europe as well. Actually, in Europe, if you allow to me, I told you before that, Miguel, about my story from just being a migrant, just came to Europe. I faced the same problems. I have a lot of skills I gained from my past experience. I used to work in United Nations in Palestine, in Gaza, and in livelihood, by food security and livelihood sector as information manager and data analysis. So when I came to Europe, I just started to, okay, where can I work? And when I started to look at the job titles, I didn't find anything relevant to me. Even if I found like job titles that I would think, yes, I can work in this job. And when I see what are the skills that are needed, no, they are not the same skills that they were needed in my country, in Palestine. So this is so important to have information both sided about my skills and where exactly I can invest in my tools. And for example, also talking about this story, I just this is how even I have my job in SkillLab. This is how I started to work in SkillLab. When I reached the point of this frustration that where I can invest in my skills, I was invited by SkillLab to have a test in the beginning of having this tool to test the prototype, if this works for people like me or not. And when I did this skill assessment or performed the skill profiling process in the tool that SkillLab developed at that time, when I went back, they just called me and told me, hey, we want you to work with us as human-centered design specialist. For me, I would never apply for this job because I don't know about what human-centered design specialists would do, what the skills that are needed. And for SkillLab, they know more than me because they have the data. They know exactly what are my skills and where exactly my skills can be matched in the new labor market.
Thank you. That's a really, again, very, very interesting exchange. I mean, I think we could probably have a whole session talking about the profiling and data issues you mentioned as well, and what things are inferred by certain set of profiling techniques before we start, which is very interesting. But getting back to something that you started at in the opening part of your intervention then, as I'd like to perhaps ask a question back to Alex. I mean, Azza, you mentioned really that there's something about the relationship between what the state thinks somebody should do, what the individual believes they should do, and what their skills would actually enable them to do, which is a very interesting kind of set of three pillars perhaps for thinking about what's realistic. But listening to very interesting interventions from all four of you, I think a picture's emerging that the world is changing very quickly, the labour market is evolving very quickly, and whatever governments may like to do about it, there's not much they can do to address some of these fundamental issues. And given this degree of change, Jenna made the point that we need to be agile, because that's the only logical response to such a changing world, which I think is a very kind of logical conclusion. But perhaps if I could come back to Alex now. I mean, Alex, given this situation, I mean, how far do you really think co-creation should go? And perhaps reining it back a bit with all the kind of limitations and issues that your colleagues have really described, how far do you think it can go? So perhaps two questions there for you, Alex, really. How far should it and how far can it go, given the world we're working in?
I think it can go a lot further than it has. I think it's quite exciting, actually. As I said at the outset, I was quite sceptical, but I think as I've thought more and more about the issue, I've become more excited. But I do think it raises, and this is back to my activation point, and I take Emma's kind of pessimism of the intellect over my optimism of the will. But you know, I think actually Azza's point there is really relevant to the way in which the labour market's changing. And one of the problems with the activation model is that PES services have focused more and more on one section of the labour market and one section of job seekers. And actually the way in which the labour market's changing does mean that I think it's in everybody's interest for PES to be a little bit more like they started out as a kind of a labour exchange, because and as a kind of an information intermediary, because the reality is that skills demand is changing quite rapidly. Employers don't always know what the next new trend is in their sector. One employer in that sector might, but the others don't. PES can be a source of information flow between those, using some of those techniques, I'm sure, and others. I don't begin to pretend to understand artificial intelligence at all. I can add up just about, but beyond that, I find it difficult. But also job seekers, because I mean, you know, employers won't know what to call some of these new jobs, and certainly job seekers won't understand what they are necessarily. I think the COVID thing has brought some of that to the fore, because certainly in the UK, you've got people who have never experienced welfare claims before, suddenly having an experience of that system and being quite shocked by how some of that works. If we're going to adjust successfully to a changing labour market, I think the role of PES as an information exchange, not just co-creating the labour market with job seekers, but also with employers, I think is going to be really significant. So I think actually it may well be that co-creation in that kind of normative way that you were asking the question, Eamon, is absolutely essential to a successful adjustment to technology change, and particularly for somewhere like the UK, which is, you know, by its own choice excluded itself, or potentially excluded itself in the future, from large markets. So, you know, a successful adjustment after Brexit to labour market changes pretty significant for the future success of the economy, but also social inclusion, you know, controlling poverty and all these kinds of really important things. Not to say, not even to get into the kind of climate change that you raised before. So yeah, I think normatively it should go much, much further. And I think it's a really exciting concept to think through, but there are lots and lots of risks, as everybody's pointed out. So, you know, we can quite easily rebrand all sorts of initiatives as co-creation, which aren't really co-creation. I read a report yesterday on this issue. It's branding randomized control trials somehow as co-creation. I can't think of anything that would be more the opposite end of the spectrum. But I do think it's an important area and potentially an exciting way to develop employment services into the future.
Thank you. Yeah, randomized control trials and co-creation is quite an interesting leap, actually. I kind of ponder that one after our discussion this morning. Perhaps, Jenna, picking up on Alex's point there, I mean, I know in your organisation you've been thinking a lot about the whole issue of how data is going to drive things in the future. How far do you think that perhaps the role of an employment service can evolve into more of a classic information exchange, which is where we came into this perhaps 150 years ago almost now? And how far do you think that the PES can adapt to a co-creation world with a role as a kind of data exchange organisation? Do you think it's a feasible kind of USP for the PES going forward into the future?
Yes, I'm a dreamer and I'm an optimist, yes. And I see indeed, as you well know, Eamon, there are, I have quite some brilliant colleagues who are thinking on this, and it's, I guess, a logical step of this intense working with partners. And I think Emma has mentioned, did you say the word competition, like cooperation and competition?
Yeah.
Yes.
To go away from the competition mode, which is where we're at the moment, unfortunately, and it's not creating the solutions for the end users that we need. The changing our role and putting ourselves in the middle, not as the conductor and organizer of everything, but as the, yes, taker, gatherer of information and giver of that. So other organizations, other people can use these bits to provide bits and pieces of these personalized services that we need. And it will be necessary really to, I think, to have this change management process with all these partner organizations as well, to change a mindset that we're no longer competing for the job seeker and for the subsidy, but we are complementing each other. And I think exchanging data and exchanging expertise will help create this setting. I'm very curious myself of how Actiris will be doing this. How are we going to manage it? I don't yet know, but I feel that that is where we want to go.
Thank you. Perhaps Emma, I think you gave a very kind of rich description of some of the kind of conflicts and tensions at the moment in political will to devise and design certain programs, and the way the world is almost kind of moving beyond them and around them, actually. Perhaps Emma could ask you, what do you think it would actually take for this kind of process to work its way through, and a fundamental change of thinking in terms of people who are still quite wedded to a kind of classic purchaser provider model that was really introduced in rather a different world, actually? Nobody was talking about the gig or platform economy in 1990 or 1995. So are we just going to carry on struggling with this kind of fairly outmoded concept? Or do you think something will happen that really drives a fundamental review of the drive from the centre?
Grandson's looking for Friday night attention here.
Oh, hi there.
We'll wrap it up soon.
I think Honestly, I think it will just contract, and what's new is normal again, and what's old is new again. And I wouldn't be surprised if we keep cycling, because at the end of the day, labour markets are local things, and people have to respond locally. As much as we have globalisation, the conditions that occur, even in a country like Sweden, like the differences between operating in Stockholm and Västerås, only 1 hour away, are vast, and we need to be aware of what's going to work in those different localized regions, which is why more and more in procurement, localization are the biggest scorers to win a bid. But the data is important, and I'm optimistic as well about the data. And I think the more that we can be smart about the use of data to understand local labour markets as well as individuals' skills and attributes and mindset, functional digital literacy, without over-assessing them at the same time, the more we can be human in our interactions. I think we lost a lot of that with activation and rules, and that's my optimism about all right, just a sec, love, about our sector right now. I think I'm hopeful that the data and artificial intelligence, and like you, Alex, I don't know much about AI. I don't even know how to spell it, is my AI joke. But I'm hopeful that it allows us to be more human in our interactions rather than less, and that the compliance and all of that sits in the background, but that time spent with the job seeker is way more human, kind and meaningful. And the best skill of a consultant is listening and analytics.
Yeah, perhaps I could ask you, Emma, one follow-up to that, because I think you made the point earlier that lots of the political rhetoric and some of the policy implications of that are about kind of governments trying to ensure there's still a degree of legitimacy in terms of the way the welfare system operates on behalf of the people who are voters, taxpayers, etc. I suppose activation, in the way it's presented, can be a device for achieving that. What I think you and your colleagues are describing is perhaps a much more pragmatic, realistic response to what's actually going on in the world now. But can you see that being sold in the same way activation is sold, if you forgive the phrase, to the kind of wider public, really? Because I think we've all got our own views about how effective sanctions, etc. are, but it's a clear message that can be relayed to people. What you've all described this morning is fascinating, but I wonder how it can be kind of reduced to a sort of a soundbite that people think, yes, this is really worth doing, which I believe it is, but
it's so popular with in Australia. We have this work for the dole, which is the cruelest of all of our activation methods. It's the one after every other lever has been pulled and it didn't work, you go to work for the dole. And it's most popular with our Labor voters because they think that they're hard tax-paying dollars that they've worked for. Why should that person sit on the dole and not have to do anything to get it? And it doesn't go anywhere. It hasn't gone anywhere for 20 years. It gets criticised by not-for-profits and charities and human rights organisations, but no party's willing to let it go because it couldn't score well in an election. I don't know what the balance is. I think data can assist us with activation, or this documentary evidence and activity for the sake of applying for jobs and be seen to be a good unemployed person. I think the data can assist us to be making sure that the choices a job seeker can make in their required activities are actually meaningful to progress and track them. I like what you said, Azza, about the skills I have, the skills required, and what do I want to do. You know, if that was the policy framework for activation, I think would be far more effective and people would feel much better and more motivated about their job search journey and the situation that they found themselves in being unemployed, which is, you know, traumatic for so many.
Yeah, thank you, Emma. Yeah, I could see a set of very kind of progressive and much more perhaps interesting and useful performance metrics emerging from Azza's description, actually, of our own experience. So thank you for that. Very sadly, we're moving into our last 10 minutes, and I think it's been a fascinating conversation. But perhaps before handing back to Miguel for concluding, perhaps if I could ask Jenna, Azza and Alex, just in turn, if they could just maybe if they were in the position of being able to sell co-creation to somebody who could really decide that was the way we were going to go, would Jenna, then Azza, and then Alex maybe just give a couple of minutes about what they think would be the key selling points for a transition towards this different way of delivering employment services that we've been talking about this morning? So what do you think would convince people, if we could convince them, to change direction?
Shall I start?
Yeah, do, Alex. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, just to, I mean, Emma's point there about, the kind of public opinion kind of stuff, I think is really important right now. So, whereas I said before, lots of new people have experienced being unemployed or, and using employment services. Some really interesting survey research recently in the UK showed, really widespread support for furlough, really widespread concern about what the long-term impact of COVID might be, but then in abstract. But then when it came to questions about, what do you think about people who lost their jobs in the pandemic, there was really no solidarity at all. It was probably their fault. It was the kind of most prominent answer, which I think really underlies some really important issues here. So I think actually the co-creation selling point has got to be around, is this the kind of service that you would like to experience if you were in this position? And telling those kind of human stories alongside data on effectiveness, because I think one of the things that we've got to get better at doing is showing what is effective. So not or questioning what is effective. So job outcomes, quick job outcomes are great and they're easy to demonstrate, but they're not necessarily effective. So if you measure the same thing over 10 years, if you shorten your perspective and measure job outcomes over a year, that might look effective. But if you look at those people's 10-year trajectory, it might look much less effective in terms of the types of work that they've been able to get, the kind of tax contributions they've been able to make, all those things. So I think the selling issue around co-creation has got to be about long-term outcomes and effectiveness, and about the personal experience of people like you experiencing this service. I think that would be the selling point for co-creation.
Thank you very much. Azza, could I put you on the spot now? Would you have maybe just a couple of minutes to tell us what you think would be the key selling points to really get people to change the way the system operates more in line with the way your organization perhaps operates?
Yeah, I just want to start from where Alex just ended his point, that talking more about experience like you, and not only people like you who are working in those public employment services or working in this field, also stories and case studies of people or best practices of people were served by public employment services or employment services in general, that they really involved more the people in their in the design of those employment services for those people. Also, again, from my work, I was exposed to many experiences or many approaches from different employment services in different countries. So I can tell you that you can find really in one organization how much people they are so open-minded for change, and that the key word here is really changing, that the standard employment services can't serve all those people who are affected now by the trends that is hitting the labor market nowadays. So as much as those organizations are open-minded to try new things, to be more innovative, to deliver more personalized and customized services for their clients, it's clear and obvious that sustainability aspect is there when they are talking about outcome or evaluating outcomes. So searching for best practices presented for the stakeholders and the ecosystem of the employment service will help a lot on like convincing and selling in this point.
Thank you. And perhaps if I could give the last word to Jenna. I think the Brussels City region is very fortunate to have a very open-minded employment service. But Jenna, perhaps if I could ask you,
exactly, and that's why we now have a lot of discussions with Actiris about that.
Indeed, which is excellent proof of the ecosystem.
Yeah.
So Jenna, perhaps I could offer you the last word. What would you do to kind of promote even more of what you're doing at the moment? Do you think in just a couple of minutes, really, what do you think are the really strong selling points to say we really need to do more of this? Or perhaps persuading other parts of the world who are not so keen on the agenda, how would you sell it to them?
I was actually thinking more on the internal organization level.
Yeah, fine, Bob. Yeah, that's no problem.
Business processes and efficiency.
Yeah.
I think it'd be good if we designed more of our processes and services, taking all the different users into account, because at the moment you have an idea and you talk about it with a few people and then you implement it, or the government decides and you implement it. And then there's a lot of problems. For the end user, it's not what they wanted. And internally, it doesn't match the different processes. They're not adapted, and you don't deliver actually what you wanted to. And co-creation will take longer, but you will have foreseen all these different obstacles, and you will have integrated them in what you actually have designed. And so I think once you get to the design, it will be better, and you will be more aware as well that there will still be some things that will keep on not working, and that you will just have to keep on changing. So it's this change of mindset of, we've created something and it's got to stay this way because we've created it, to the process of creation is agile and complex, and the process of delivery will stay as well open to adaptation.
Thank you. That's great. Well, I'd like to personally thank all four of you for a fascinating discussion. You've really crammed an incredible amount of really interesting information into an hour and a half, and it's just flown by. And I've got a feeling that Miguel and I may well be getting back to the four of you in not too distant future to perhaps see if we could pursue this a bit further. But thank you very much indeed. And if I can hand back to Miguel to sadly close our discussion this morning. Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much. I'm also sad, but I think the grandson of Emma is probably not. So just a very quick
and the glass of wine that's
okay, all right.
Yeah.
I just gonna summarize for 2 minutes what I heard, and I'm very happy that you were so open and willing to answer all the questions. And as Eamon said, it would be great to continue this discussion. So we started by saying, by talking a bit about the definition of co-creation, that it's a bit of a label that is put on many things that often are neither co nor creation, so that just things that are pre-decided. They lack sometimes an eye level or partnership approach, and nobody apart from the deciding entity is really creating there. On the other hand, we saw a couple of examples where co-creative approaches in public and private employment services and companies do create a culture of empathy, of involvement, and ultimately motivate people who are involved in it, and then also set good examples to colleagues or to partners. So they are successful examples of co-creation that also create some buy-in for the end users and for those that are then going to use it. We said on the other end of the spectrum that in a, let's say, employment service reality, co-creation is often hampered or made impossible by the setting. Employment services, procurement, and competition between providers operates, which makes it close to impossible in some cases to really sit around the table and co-create on eye level. on a more optimistic, forward-looking note, we said that there is a lot of potential to build on. First of all, there are already cooperative traditions in many countries, and co-creation is just like an updated version of working in partnerships, which has been done in some jurisdictions for many decades. We, however, also said that one maybe basic factor that needs to develop much more if we want to get more co-creative, especially from the public side, is to start listening to those that are going to use the service, and to make better use of data, to open up in general to approaches of involving more people, of sharing responsibility and listening at the end of the day. So this is a lot about the role of public employment services also, and the balance between normative ways of cooperation, but maybe also changing the way the institutions work, having a more open mindset to involve the end users. And we've heard quite a lot of optimism around that's also the way the agility and responsiveness to a fast-moving labor market might, put public employment services in a position to do that. And so on the final note, something I found inspiring is also in settings like this one, for example, where we have been talking about the topic of co-creation, but we are people who are involved in it directly. We're steering it in a way, we're talking about it on an intellectual level. It's important to involve more cases, actual cases, to ask the people who are using it to start listening more, to involve more, and to create more together with us to further discuss this topic of co-creation. Thanks a lot for your time. 1.5 hours took of your valuable time. Have a good day. Thanks a lot.
Thanks a lot.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Yes.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.
Thanks all. See you later.
See you again.
Later. Bye.